Well, this is Christmas Day, December 25, 1996. Right now it's bright and sunny out. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I got up about 8 o'clock this morning and had a little cup of coffee. And but things are going good. My neighbors next door brought in my breakfast. The Belmores, who live right next door to me, Bob and Jan Bradmore, brought me my breakfast. Boy, can you guess what it was? It was kielbasa, scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, bread for toast, and a date nut bread. Just beautiful, beautiful. Now, these neighbors moved in the what you call the Tischler house next door. And, of course, I had those kids in school. Bob is now retired. He spent about 30 years on the boats. And I went to school with some of his older brothers. They were in high school when I was. Bob is the youngest of 12 kids. And this is interesting to note, too, that Jan, his wife, her name was Malik, Jan Malik. And her mother was Stella Yarch. And Stella Yarch and I were in kindergarten together back in 1917. Can you imagine that? Just beautiful, beautiful memories that come back. Well, today, as I say, I want to make another tape here, but you recall the last one I made out of Dan's diary, the year 1914. And I sent that thing on to George to kind of evaluate to see what he thought of the idea. And after I sent it out, I have to think, there are certain things on there that people like Grace and George and Treese might not understand, simply because Dad in his diary just mentioned names. He didn't necessarily identify people. He would say Schmeichel came over, or Bert came over. Well, I knew who those people were, but I don't know, and you knew too if you know the full name. So I thought today I'd probably review some of the old people that Dad mentions in these tapes before I get into the year 1915, so that you'd have an idea of what he was talking about. Now, you got to remember that I knew a lot of these people. I knew them well. Many times I didn't know everything that Dad wrote in the diary, no, because their names mentioned that I'd never heard of. But that had to do with his business association with the bank. But anyway, I thought, well, I'm going to identify these people so that when you hear it mentioned in the year 1915-16, you know what Dad was talking about. Now, for example, in the diary, it quite often speaks about Eddie, E-D-D-I-E. Well, that's Edward Grambua, the guy who lived in Mount Pleasant. Now, when Dad got married in 1908, Eddie and Otto and Willie were still on the farm, along with Irma and along with Martha. And so when they go back out, they would talk about these people, but they didn't identify them necessarily as his sister. He just mentioned their names. Now, for example, it says that in the Grambua family, you've got to remember that when Dad left the farm, we might say, he had been teaching. You remember, he taught in the Metz area there for probably 5, 6 years or 7 years, or whatever it might be. He started teaching when he was about 18 years old. And he taught several of the districts of Metz, and he taught several of the districts of Posen. And so he had a lot of his own brothers and sisters in his classes. When he taught at the Metz school, at the Grambua school, which was just, a quarter of a mile away from the Grambua home, he had Willie, and he had Otto, and he had Eddie, and he had Martha, and he had Irma in his classes. Now, he also had Louise and Bertha, Dora, and Carl in his classes. Now, he didn't have Mother, because Mother completed her schooling in 1900 and 1906 or 1905. When she was 14, she went as far as she could, and that's as far as she went. And so he missed Mother by 1 year, but did have birth the rest of them. Now, Mother at that time, of course, went to work for her uncle in Albert Hardy's, who had the general store in Metz. And there, as you recall, she waited on trade. She worked in the post office there and waited on general trade, got to know all the people in the area. And in addition to that, of course, Mother played the organ. And she was the organist at St. Peter's Church from about age 14 on. She apparently was had a good, had the ability to play that organ very well. Now, where did she learn to play the organ? Well, there was a minister at the Metz Church at that time by the name of Teamy. And he was an organist as well as a preacher. He had an organ in his home as well as there was an organ in the church. And Grandpa Gramberg had bought an organ. And that's where Mother, of course, she took lessons from this minister. And then later on, when she was about 14, or 13 or 14, she started to play at the church. And she played at the church for a good number of years and got to be quite talented about it. And so right after Dad and Mother built their new home, that's one of the first things that Dad bought. He bought an organ for Mother. And, of course, Mother continued to play for her own amusement. It was just wonderful. So, okay, here we go. So, but as I say, these people that are mentioned here are many of them. Now, of course, there are a lot of other people that are mentioned here, as you can well get. Now, when Mother and Dad were married, they moved here into Rogers City. They got married in 1908 in May, and then the fire came in October, wiped everything out. And so as you recall at that time, immediately right after the fire, just within a few days, Bertha and Louise left and went to stay with some relatives in Alpena. And that from there they progressed on to Toledo, where they went into nurses training at Grambua Hospital. But that's a story unto itself. Now, then of course, Otto and Willie and those fellows. Now, Uncle Otto, for example, stayed on the farm there for a while, and then I think he got married in 1915 to Aunt Dora. And shortly after that, he came to Rogers City. And just down the block in what you would call the Kronsky house. That was a house that had been built by Theodore Nagel. He lived there for a year or so, and then Otto and Dora rented it. And then, of course, later on, Otto and Dora went back to Metz. Now, at the same time, Eddie, who was out staying on the farm, helping Dad, helping Grandpa, Grambua, and then he would, for the wintertime, sometimes he came to school at Rogers. He stayed with Mother and Dad and went to school. Now, the school at that time in Rogers City didn't go any further than the 10th grade, but Ed did come and stay there for the wintertime. And some of his class, he had H.H. Gilpin as a teacher, and some of his classmates there was Rudolph Delgin and Earl Delgin, and W.F. White's son, Butch Hasenberg, and Archie Schultz. Those were some of the fellows that he knew as a young man. Now, Ed didn't get married until about 1922 or 23, where he married Jesse McGee from Lake City. And then, of course, in the intervening years, he had managed to get down to central Michigan. He managed to get to Michigan State, got his degree in agriculture, and went back to Mount Pleasant, got a job in the schools there. And then he was very, very closely associated with Michigan State, of course. And so a lot of the kids that came out of central Michigan who wanted to go on and become ag teachers worked under Eddie. Eddie was an ag specialist, and his specialty was beans. And, of course, beans were a very prominent product, especially in the Saginaw Valley, and became a kind of a bean expert. But I know that many of the fellows that I knew in education afterwards who were in agriculture had had Eddie as their practice teacher when they originally started at Mount Pleasant. He was well known. Now then, of course, we had another fellow in the family, in the Hardeese family, that was well-known in education, and that was Edward Hardeese out of Belknap. He became a college professor, as you recall, afterwards at the University of Wisconsin, and he, in his early days, had taught rural schools, just like Ed had taught rural schools out in the Belknap area. The they here primarily is that these people are mentioned in that diary, but they're only mentioned either by the first or the second name, and you got to know who you're talking about. Now, for example, in the Hardeese family, the family that took over the adjacent old Dramberg farm was Edward Hardeese. He was the father. He was married to Emma, Julius Dramberg's sister, youngest sister, and she inherited that farm from the old folks when they went back to Detroit in the early days. And in that family, her brother Ed, Grandma Dramberg's brother Ed, was in German was known as Edert. And in this will, in this diary of Dad, sometimes it mentions that Uncle Edert came, E-D-E-R-T. Now that's the German spelling for Edward. Now Ed Hardeese also had a son Edward, and Bill Hardeese had a son Edward. So there's three Edward Hardeeses. You got to know who they're talking about when they're talking about this Ed Hardeese. And now, Grandpa Grambua is referred to here in Dad's diary. Grandma and Grandpa are referred to as Pa and Ma. When he talks about Pa and Ma coming down, he meant his folks. Now, if it's my mother's folks or the Drambergs that come down, he calls it Grandpa Dramberg or Grandmother Dramberg. But sometimes it gets just a little bit confusing. But nevertheless, these are all people that were well known that came out of, you might say, the Metz area. Oh, there are a lot of other people in the Metz area that he mentions just here by family name. For example, it mentions here that something about the Haskies, something about the Kowalskis, something about the Orbans, something about the Kanyas, something about the Skiras, the Kapalas, the Achtabuskis, the Kajbuskis, the Smolinskis and Chevellas, the Emkes, the Reisners, the Taylors, the Tlaskas, Hasenberg, Hilla, Wisniewski, Dumsches, Beatties, Schalks, Brunings, Grulkes, Krefts, Repkes, Wirgos, Wolgas, Philax, Sorgafries, Braysky, Petz, Togetsky, Rieger, Hanico, Kreglow, Stricker, McCutcheon, Kuhlman, Bertram. All of these are family names of these early people that were around here that he was in daily contact with. Lots of people right from Rogers City, other people right out here from Rogers Township, or Bulky Township, or Metz Township. But these were people that they had contact with on a regular basis. And a lot of these people, of course, were good friends of his. Quite often in the diary, it'll mention Schmekel. Well, that's probably Otto Schmekel. It could have been Fred, but chances are it was Otto because they fished and hunted a lot together. Bertram, well, chances are it was Bert Bertram next door, but then there was also Adolf Bertram. Then there was Klee. Well, chances are that was Henry Klee. Henry Klee later became postmaster, and he's the family I said that moved to Detroit. Then there was Schrader, Alfred Schrader. Well, he was the local guy that Dad taught with in the early days out here. Then he went back to the University of Michigan and became a dentist. And the guy stayed on at the University of Michigan in the School of Dentistry. Yeah, it was pretty darn good. Now, he was the father of Grace Elaine, his dad. And some of the other people remember the triplets, the Schrader triplets. Well, after the dad died, after Alfred died, the family moved back here to Rogers City. And the mother, Alma, got in with her sister, Mrs. Why do you follow the name? Annie Clements. Annie Clements and Alma Schrader had a restaurant right next to the old Star Theater down there. And when Marion first came to town here in the fall of 1939, that's where she ate most of her meals. A nice, very well-known restaurant here at that time. Now, here's another name that comes up here. I notice it mentions here Teresa Hardees and Louise Hardees. Well, Teresa married Albrecht Kowaleski. Louise married Sam Voigt, and that's where Shirley Voigt comes in, who now lives in Cleveland. Now, here's another name that comes into that in this diary that I noticed. Ernest Bright. Now, Ernest Bright was from Alpena. And Ernest Bright's aunt was Ernestine Bright Grambua. That was Herman Grambua's, my grandmother's nephew. And I knew him. He came over to the house several times. In fact, he used to deliver bread, I think, for Dolo's Bread in Rogers City many, many years ago. And every once in a while in the winter, he'd get stuck here in Rogers City. He'd come over and spend the night at the house. I don't know whether it happened to him. I've tried to figure out lately. I can't find anybody in Alpena that knows him. But at the time, they lived on Dawson Street in Alpena. And Ernest Bright. Isn't that something? And now, Ernestine Bright, who married Grandpa Grambua in Alpena, she died in 1887 at the birth of Helen Grambua. And you remember the story was there that a lady by the name of Mrs. Brino was attending to Mother, I suppose, as a midwife, which was very common in those days because a lot of kids that were born, there was no doctor around, and she died. And so, but the child was alive, and so Grandpa asked her to take the child with her, and so she did. And I don't know whether, I don't think that she never adopted the child, she just raised the child. All her life until she left around here, probably around age 15 or so, that she left. But my dad had her as one of his students when he taught in the Met School. And my mother, Alma, remembers her as a kid in school. She was about 2 years older than this girl was born in 1887, and my mother was born in 1889. And so when my mother said, well, she was probably about the third grade or so, well, this girl was in the fifth grade. Very nice girl, she said. She remembers her well, and I remember the girl later years. Long about in the late 40s, when I was back here teaching, I know that she came one time. She came out of Chicago, and she brought her granddaughter with her. And we stayed and visited. She was a very, very pleasant lady. And I know Mother and Dad, on 2 occasions that I remember, went down to Chicago to see her. She lived down there. She was living with her third husband at the time. She left, Mother said she thought, when she was probably about 15 years old, and went to Bay City to stay with a relative of the Brinos. Now, the Brinos were well-known farmers out there. In fact, Mrs. Adolf Schrader out there, Sr., was a Brino. And they're buried there at that Schrader Cemetery that where our grandmother, or mine, your grandmother, George and Grace, are buried. Ernestine is buried there. That's right next to the Schrader farm. And the Brinos lived on that Schrader farm after, before the Schraders had it. And so this is all part of the story. Now, the girl Helen left, Mother said she thought when she was probably about 14 or 15, and went to Bay City, and she worked as a domestic. Well, that's very common. Went to work for some well-known family, I suppose, down in Bay City. And she, while there, she married a fellow, and the name of the first fellow she married was the name of a Moltken teen. Well, apparently it didn't last too long. And then she married a fellow by the name of LaChance. And with Chance, she had 3 kids, a girl and 2 boys. Now, I don't know whatever happened to those kids. But And then LaChance died, and the one I didn't know LaChance. I didn't know. Then the third husband was a fellow by the name of Van Vormer. And Van Vormer, they were married when they lived in Chicago. And that's where Mother and Dad visited her in Chicago. On a couple of occasions, they would stop and see her. Now, occasionally, she came back and would stay. And most of the time, she stayed with Uncle Henry out there in Metz. But I remember being in the house there. This is along in the late 40s. I was already back here teaching. Very pleasant lady, and had a good sense of humor. And she had her granddaughter with her. The granddaughter at that time was probably about 14 or 15 years old. And, but, well, you understand that Helen and the other brothers and sisters, they got along fine. There was no, it's just one of those things that happen in life. And I know that Marion asked Amelia, that is, what we call Grandma Grambua, or she, of course, later on married a fellow named Han, but nevertheless, she asked her about it. Well, she said when she took over there, right after Ernestine died, she was only 14. Hi! Hi. The hello that you hear on that tape there was my good friend Del Conley just stopping in. Now Del later I had Del as a student in school, and then later he came back here and taught music. And some years ago, he became the superintendent of schools, and he's now is retired. And he does stop in to see me, and he just bought me a nice bottle of Kessler's whiskey. Isn't that nice for Christmas? Just beautiful. Well, now to get back to our story here, we're talking about Helen, who was Dad's sister. Now, I'm gonna talk about other things here that are mentioned in this will, just names of people that are referred to, and so I thought I would probably just review that a little bit further. Now, Dad's brothers and sisters, with the exception of Emma, of course, who lived in Canada, would stop in frequently at the house there on 3rd Street. Now, it just so happens that at the time that Dad got married in 1908, he was the oldest one, of course, of that family. Then Henry got married in 1910. Out there in Metz, he married a girl named Helen Ludwig from the Krakow area. And Uncle Billy married Cassie Nowlin from Millersburg. And they would stop in. They lived in Millersburg, they lived in Onaway, they lived in Lansing, I think, until finally Willie settled and they made their home in Onaway for a good number of years, where he worked at the wheel factory. And then there are other ones here in that family that are referred to here quite frequently. They're just mentioned by their first name. And there's, for example, there's Aunt Martha, who married Gus Litke. They were married in 1913, and quite often it refers to that Gus and Martha came down. Then it'll say something about Gus and Martha bought a house in Roger City. And then in 1914, Irma Grambua married Herb Hine in September 7th, 1914, and it refers to those people. Then they came to town here. And then in 1915, Uncle Otto married Dora Dramberg in 1915, and they came to town. Now, I might say something about Otto and Dora. Shortly after they were married, they came to town, and for a period of time, I don't know how long, year and a half, or whatever it is, they lived just about a block away from Mother and Dad. They lived in what you and I would call the Krotsky house. They lived in there, and Otto, for a period of time, worked at Michigan Lime. But then, of course, he did go back to Metz. So then Ed Grambua, of course, was the youngest of the boys, and he was helping Grandpa on the farm. And in the diary, it mentions that Eddie was down. Eddie came down to a dance, or Eddie came down to Roger City and then went to Hawks to a dance. He was very, very social. Now you got to remember that Ed, as I mentioned before, did go to school here in Rogers City up to the 10th grade, and he stayed with Mother and Dad while he was doing that. And he knew a good number of the young guys in Rogers City. He knew the Elgin boys, he knew Bud, and he knew Earl, and he knew a lot of the Kuhlman boys, and Butch Hasenberg and Clark, and just a good number of fellas that he knew at the time that he went here up to as far as the 10th grade. And then, of course, later on, as you remember, he evidently went down to Mount Pleasant, went to school there just like Dad did, and then he went on to Michigan State and got his degree in agriculture there, and then he came back to Mount Pleasant to teach. And I think that's was Mount Pleasant, that's where he met Jesse McGee from Lake City. It says it's just interesting to note that Jesse McGee was from Mount Pleasant, and she and Marion got to know each other quite well. And I'll be darned if way back in there someplace through the Doudnas, Jesse and Marion were distant cousins. Isn't that strange? How that happens. Now I know that Ed occasionally went back to Michigan State for refresher courses, and in fact about 1932 he was partly came down for some special class from Mount Pleasant to Michigan State, and I met him there on a couple of occasions. We had lunch, I remember, at Hunt's Cafeteria, and he was staying in his fraternity house. I don't know the name of the fraternity house, but it was located in that triangular land that George and Martha would know, right across from the People's Church between Saginaw and Michigan. He belonged to a fraternity in that particular area. But I did occasionally see him there at Michigan State where he taught. And also at Michigan State at that time, about 1933, that's when Ed Hardeese, who was a college professor, came back and taught several classes at Michigan State during that period of time, and I met him on campus. So these are things that I just thought that I would mention as I go along here. Now, also in this diary of Dad's, Mother and Dad went back and forth to Metz very frequently. They would go by train, or they no doubt went by sleigh, or they went by horse and buggy. But quite frequently, it just says in Dad's diary that Mother went to Metz with the boys, or Mother went to Metz with the boys, left the boys, and came back. And then they would go on a trip. They were frequently made trips here. They would go to Detroit to visit some of the relatives, some of the Drambergs down there. And so it goes back and forth. Now also in this diary, it mentions certain things that just taken for granted at that time, that we would assume, but he would know. Well, I don't know whether he intended it, that we would be going through his diary or not. But he mentions going out to Metz, for example, and he said he helped Henry shear sheep. Okay, well, you got sheep, you got to shear and get the wool off them. And then said that they went to quilting bees. Very common to have, making quilts out of the wool came off the sheep. And then they went to corn husking bees. Now, corn husking, I remember taking part in that one time. The corn would be picked off while it was standing in the fields, or sometimes they didn't have time. They cut the whole thing and brought the whole stacks in. They'd rip off the ears, and then after it dried, then they would take the ears and they would peel them back, get the husk off there. And then, of course, after the husks were off, then, of course, they could put that corn through a machine, and it would knock off the kernels, and then the kernels, of course, could be used for food, for the cattle or the horses, or not so much, but for the pigs, chickens. And then, of course, the corn could also be taken to the mill and ground into cornmeal. And then it also mentions here that on one occasion I mentioned a feather stripping party, a feather party. Well, what would happen there is that when they had chickens or ducks, mostly ducks or geese, the feathers were picked off. Now the big feathers on the edge of the wings would be picked out, and then later on there were those at parties, those long feathers would be cut off. The feathers would be cut off the quills, and those feathers, of course, became the source of your feather beds, feather pillows. Very interesting things that happened in those days. Then, of course, it refers to the fact that Dad said that he went to Metz, and referring to Pa and Ma or Gramberg's, and helped them butchering. Well, they were probably butchering hogs in the fall of the year. And that was always an occasion. Several of the neighbors got together to butcher hogs. And I remember watching that procedure on several occasions. And then there was the sausage making, where the fresh pork mixed with a certain amount of beef was ground up, put into casings, and then that sausage was smoked. You had your own smoked sausage. Mother and Dad used to make some right in the kitchen table there in the old house. And then also refers to it here frequently, they went to Metz to take part in the thrashing. The thrashing machines would come. You have a certain amount of wheat and oats and barley that had to be thrashed. Machines would come in, big boiler, and steam operated with a big flywheel on it, big leather belt, maybe 30, 40, 50 feet long, would drive the machine. That thing was fired with wood, water, and probably have a crew of maybe 10 or 15, 20 men would come in and help you do the threshing. And they went from farmer to farmer, these guys. And they were just loaned out. Carl would go out and work for a couple of days. The machines quite often were company-owned machines. 4 or 5 or 6 farmers would go together to buy a thrashing machine. And then after they thrashed their own, then they went out and thrashed for others to make a few bucks. And then it also refers here, he went to a barn raising. I remember going to a barn raising out there in Rogers Township in the Spence area, where the Frederick boys, Bob and Louie, were in charge of barn building. Now, they were originally barn builders that came from the Higginsville area, the Fredericks. And they had a crew of men out there, and they raised the large timbers that formed the barn. A group of guys with the ropes and wooden pegs, and they raised the framework by which that barn was built. Very, very interesting. You see it referred to often on TV. I saw it the other day where they were watching the barn being raised out to New York. The Mennonites were replacing a barn that had been burned by fire. Well, that's the way they did that. Farmers would gather together and raise a barn for some farmer who got the necessary timbers together. And then they usually have, after they had the big framework up, then they would have a shingling bee, and a bunch of guys would get together and shingle that barn. Many of the shingles that were made here locally. There were some shingle mills in the area where they would take these beautiful cedars, great big cedars, and cut the shingles. And then, of course, they were used, most of the homes, of course, originally most all the homes around here, and wooden shingles. Now, of course, there are asbestos or other products, but originally it was wood. And, of course, very tender. Shingling, of course, shingles were very volatile, burning. And then, of course, it refers to, I remember one place it refers to here, it says that Carl was out working on the township roads. Well, what would happen there is that the township had, of course, maintained its own roads. And a farmer would spend a certain number of days, probably in the year, helping to maintain roads or build new sections of roads. And what happened there was that a farmer, using his team and a wagon, would work for the township. He didn't work for money. He would spend a day working for the township, hauling gravel or whatever had to be hauled, and to build a new section of road. And then the labor for his team and for himself was credited against his township taxes. And that's the way they helped each other out. Now, also in addition to that, of course, they had usually, every township had a town hall that had to be maintained. Every township had a little town hall which they used for political purposes. And usually that building had to be paid for in some way, and lots of times the farmers would get together and they donated their time to build a town hall. And then the town hall was used for dances, sometimes used for political purposes. And town halls are still standing today, still going. And but neighbors help neighbors a lot nowadays. And for example, if a neighbor broke a leg and he couldn't work his farm, some of the other neighbors chipped in. They went over and did this harvesting for him to help the family out. And that was very, very common, where you not only did your work, but it's loaned a certain amount of your time to your neighbor who was in trouble. Then every township, it refers here, for example, that there was a baseball game in Metz. Well, every township had its team. I know I played for the Mulkey team out here in Mulkey for several years. And recently in the paper here, a couple of weeks ago, there was a picture of the Mulkey baseball team, and there am I, along with the Sorter Fries, Jack and Hugo and Albert, and a couple of the Rieger boys, LeBrecken and Keelan Cussman, and a few other people that were on that baseball team out there in Mulkey. And but they played, and they also played basketball. Basketball became popular, long about 1910, 11 in there. And in town here, we'd say they played basketball at the rink. Well, you might say, well, where would they play basketball in Metz? Well, the only place big enough to hold kind of a little basketball court was the depot. The depot had a large freight shed attached to it. And these fellows would go in with the permission, of course, of the station agent, move the stuff around and put up a couple basketball hoops, and they played basketball. Carl played, the Kovaleski boys played, and the Schrader boys played, and the Rarings, and so forth, and their Lagners, and just a whole group of fellows. They used to have a lot of fun just playing. They played teams like Hawks and Posen and Mulkey and so forth, Craco. And then, of course, dancing was very, very popular. Quite often you'll find here, it refers to that there was a dance at the RAC Hall, or there was a dance at the Oddfellows, or there was a dance in Hagensville. Dancing was a very, very popular form of entertainment. See, they had no radio, of course, and no TV, and so every time people got together, somebody could always play the fiddle, somebody could always play the accordion, and away they would go. Very, very popular. That's interesting. Uncle Carl Ramberg was an excellent dancer, and he also called square dances. But he himself loved to dance, and I remember watching him one time at a dance. I don't remember just where it was, and boy, the ladies loved to dance with Carl. I remember up here in the extended care one time when Mother first went up there, there was a lady up there that was related to the Nagel family out in Belknap. Now, I don't know which Nagel family were. There were about 5 boys. There was Theodore Nagel, there was Emil Nagel, and there was, but this family, this girl up there in the extended care, about the same age as Mother almost, had lived in Baltimore for many, many years, but as a young girl, she lived in Belknap. And she told me that she liked when they would have a dance in that area, and Carl Dramberg, who was my uncle, would come because she said Carl could really dance. He could really move for a big man, and he was big. He was about, 260, 270 pounds, but he could really move it. Okay, now, a few other things that I thought might add in here that are referred to here. And each town, I remember one place that he says in here that he went to the township cemetery, and now the township cemetery in Metz was located on Centella Road, just a short quarter-mile away from the Catholic Church, right across from the Walter Centella farm that some of you people might know out there. There was a Catholic Church cemetery, and then just a quarter-mile down the road was the public cemetery. And I remember as a young kid going with my grandpa and grandma Dramberg to a funeral where the burial was held at the public cemetery in Metz. And I checked up just the other day with Gerald to find out if that cemetery is there, and he said yes. He said it's still there. But every township, if they wanted to, a little piece of ground was set aside for cemetery purposes. Now that is not the cemetery, the Schrader Cemetery was not a public cemetery. That was a church cemetery, because originally where that church cemetery was, where Ernestine is buried, the church was supposed to have been built across the road. Somebody had donated a couple acres of land there for a church, but the church never got built. But people died, and so as a result of it, later on when they built the church in Metz proper, of course, they also had a cemetery there, and that's where the rest of those people are buried. But some of the family members are buried at that first cemetery. And every township, as I say, had a cemetery. Now the cemetery that's right across from where I sit and make this tape, I can see the cemetery. That is a township cemetery, because at the time that that was put in there, this was part of Rogers Township. It wasn't the village of Rogers. It was outside of the village of Rogers. The original cemetery of the village of Rogers was where the courthouse stands. And when they decided that they were going to build a new courthouse in the village of Rogers for Presque County, that area had been started as a cemetery, and there were probably, I think somebody told me they thought there were probably about 20 graves that were already there where the courthouse stands. And so this 10-acre lot over here was designated as a township cemetery, a township of Rogers, and those graves were moved over here. And then they went ahead and built the courthouse on the courthouse square, that block. But that was originally the place for the first cemetery, because the village of Rogers was built along First Street. And so as a result of that, of course, even that was a block or two outside of town, and so that's why that cemetery was in that particular area. Well, that's just the way it happened in those days. But these are things that are referred to there, and as I go along with this a little further, I'll try to explain a little bit more, and when we get into 1915, as to just who Dad is referring to here, not just the first name, the second name. I'll try to, if I can, I'll try to identify that a little bit easier. I hope this probably clarifies a few things, or maybe it's just clear as mud. I don't know. But I'm having fun doing it. Today is 26th of December, and it's cold outside. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's about 15 degrees out there. It didn't snow last night, but oh, it's cold. I see people walking down the street here. They got their hoods on. I can't tell who they are, but I noticed somebody going by the other day, just a little while ago, and even though I couldn't see the face, I knew who it was by the tilt of the guy's head. Now, lots of times you don't have to see anybody, but you can tell by the way they walk, or the way they shuffle, or the way they lean their body. You know who it is. It's almost like, well, that's just the way it is. You get so that you know people by their gait.